We've seen Red Bull recover from some bad Fridays plenty of times, but I'm not sure that they've ever looked this bad. Take a look at the results from FP2 the soft tyre runs. Lando Norris, quickest, 15.624, very good lap. A bit ragged in a couple of places, ran wide, 1 point going into the last corner. I say ran wide, it was a classic Lando thing, using all the road, no early turn in, no short corners for Lando going into that last turn. And he was doing a transitory turn, actually, moving to the left and then just flicking to the right on the entry and caught the left rear, caught an edge really on the left rear, picked up the dust and ran wide in front of George Russell, who was quite amused, I think. And similarly had a couple of other incidents, locking up and so forth, but nonetheless really, really good. We'll get onto his lap in a minute. Oscar Piastri 0.3 slower, as you can see. Ferrari looking good. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton not bad. Lewis did that time on very used tyres. Again, we'll get onto that in a second. And the two Aston Martins, pretty impressive. Lance Stroll, Fernando Alonso, and in FP1 when Fernando had a bit of a crook back, his place was taken by Felipe Drugovich, an opportunity for Felipe to show his talent. Good to see that. Good to see Aston immediately putting him in the car. Third driver, perfect use of a third driver. And just for the record, he was 0.3 slower than Lance Stroll on a day when Lance Stroll was going very well in the other Aston. So good job by Felipe Drugovich. George Russell, not brilliant in the Mercedes, not bad. I mean, they're there or thereabouts, so probably get better. Kimi Antonelli not too far away on a circuit where there are no really quick corners or long quick corners. Pretty near George in everything he's doing. Isaac Hadjar, good. We haven't got to Lewis yet. Oh, there's Yuki Tsunoda. What's he doing there? 16.4. Not bad for Yuki, you could say. About where you'd expect him to be. Then Oliver Behrman, Nico Hülkenberg, Esteban Ocon. And finally, Max Verstappen, 16.791. Over a second slower than Lando Norris around a relatively short lap, the Hungaroring, which is all about downforce, traction to some extent, couple of quick corners, where Max actually looked very good. And it's a classic Max day, really, because if you followed him on board and listened to his radio, well, not listen to the radio, if you followed him on board, he looked very good in the car, as ever, disguising everything that was going on. Lovely turn-ins, everything nice. But in reality, as he reported it, driving as if he was on ice, no grip, front or rear. They tried to make some changes between the two sessions, the morning session and the afternoon one, and found about a tenth of a second, whereas Lando, just for reference, who was quickest also in the morning, went half a second quicker in the afternoon. So Red Bull obviously struggling. Max saying after the qualifying session, I'm very sure we'll get it right Saturday, Sunday. Well, we'll wait and see. This is a big gap that he's got to fill. But I suppose if you wanted some positive signs, you could look at turn 11, which is a corner I mentioned in the build-up to this race. A very quick right-hander leading onto the back straight downhill. And it's an impressive corner. 6 gear, they don't change down for that corner. And the only 3 drivers that I saw all afternoon who did not brake going in there were the 2 McLaren drivers. No surprise there. And Max Verstappen. The problem is that Max was actually lifting at a much lower speed, about 6 kilometres slower approach speed from what he'd been doing coming through the S's than the 2 McLaren drivers, slowing down to about the same speed as the 2 McLaren drivers. So you can't say it was quite as impressive, but Max looking really good there anyway. If you didn't know what the actual speeds were, you'd think, wow, Max Verstappen's quick in the Red Bull. But he wasn't over the lap. Very impressive corner though, good to see. Let's have a look also now at the sectors. That tells its own story as well. Lando Norris, quickest in Sector 2, which is all the tight bits at the top of the hill. Change of direction, looking very fluid there, as ever. Lando always does in Hungary. Oscar Piastri, quickest in Sector 3. But look who was quickest in Sector 1 on those quite scrubbed Pirelli softs. Everybody did 2 runs, but Lewis did sort of 2.5 runs. And on that last run, the last quick run, quickest in Sector 1, and not too bad thereafter. The tyres going away after that. So Lewis Hamilton looking, I thought he looked very good today. You could see going into the last corner, it's definitely the old Lewis getting in on the front end. shortening the corner in the way that Max is doing that, in the way that Charles, very difficult to tell the difference between Charles and Lewis going in there, actually, if you just watch what they're doing, the trajectory and the way they're going in, the throttle application and how they're turning in, very, very similar going into the last corner. And that's a really good sign. And the other interesting point is that Lewis and Charles, exactly the same speed through the trap at the start-finish line, well, over the start-finish line, 269 in 7th gear, as they were starting their quickest laps. And that 269, commensurate with Oscar Piastri, a little bit slower than Lando Norris. Lando just really quick through there. But Max Verstappen at the same place, at the beginning of his lap, 264, when he gave himself a really good run, and at the end of his lap, 263. So that just shows, and it's an interesting start-finish line placement, because that does reflect the exit speed, or some partial or a partial representative of the exit speed from the last corner. And you can just see how much time Max is losing just on sheer grip out of that last corner. It's astonishing to see how much sheer grip, grunt, whatever you want to call it, downforce grunt, Red Bull have lost since the halcyon days, which weren't too long ago. So difficult times for Red Bull, that is for sure. And to put a full stop on all that talk about the grip on the Red Bull, just going back to the sectors, of course you've got to put a division after Yuki Tsunoda to get way down to Max Verstappen. But look at that, 28.022, Yuki 27.848, sector 1. Max and Yuki about the same sector 2, Yuki slightly quicker in terms of a hundredth, and then Yuki again slightly quicker sector 3, and whichever way you cut it, massively slower than the McLarens and even the Ferraris. Max is saying he's confident the car will be good tomorrow, so yeah, let's wait and see. And now let's have a look at the terminal velocities at the end of the pit straight, just before the braking area into 1, on their quickest laps. Lewis Hamilton quickest in a straight line, so again, starting to look quite good for Lewis this weekend, quickest in sector 1. That top speed advantage obviously helping him to be quickest in sector 1, as we saw. Not far away from Charles on scrub tyres, on very used tyres, 324. He went off a bit as well, but he's got all that out of his system now on a Friday, I presume. Charles Leclerc 322. Both the Ferraris looking very good in terms of a compromise grip versus top speed. George Russell and Kimi Antonelli right there as well in the Mercedes. They seem to have got their downforce versus grip set up pretty right. Then Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri slower than both Ferrari and Mercedes in a straight line. So McLaren just have, again, so much downforce that they are a little bit slower in a straight line. But will it make any difference? I very much doubt it. They are that quick over the lap. And then look at that. Max Verstappen 315, Yuki Tsunoda 318. That and Yuki Tsunoda being quickest over the start-finish line, markedly quicker than Max, 270, 271 against Max's 263. Suggests that at the moment Yuki's been running a little less wing than Max Verstappen. Right at the beginning of FP2, Max did 1 lap, said the car was not good at all. They brought him in, they put 3 clicks on the front wing, and I never saw them take that out of the car, so he was running a lot of wing, and even then he kept complaining about the car feels as if it's on ice, it's got nothing going on, he can't feel the car. Didn't look that way, as I say, from the outside. There was also a bit of a weird incident for Max as well, when we saw him slowing, pulling to the right coming out of turn 1 and throwing a Red Bull rag out of the car, a towel actually. It turns out that he'd had that towel while he was sitting in the garage, wiping sweat and doing various things, and it had been left inadvertently between his legs, and it blew out when he started to pick up speed. It shouldn't have been in the cockpit at all, of course. And rather than have it sort of move around in the cockpit and go down to the footwell area, Max pulled over and threw it out. No doubt expecting he was going to get, I don't know what, a €50 fine for littering or something like that. But no, there was a different FIA interpretation to that, which was that the car had been given an unsafe release. It shouldn't have been released with that towel in it. Good point, actually. But it wasn't quite the same as leaving a block of wood in there or something like that. So he was given a reprimand for that. But an interesting thing to see that towel. I mean, it takes me back to the days when drivers often used to have rags around them, and they used them for visors and various lucky rags as well. Alan Jones had one. Mario Andretti had one. And back in the 50s and 60s, most drivers had them because you needed them just to wipe everything. They didn't have strip-off visors then, of course. So that was it, really. McLaren, no surprise to see them looking so good. They will probably continue to hold that position throughout tomorrow, going into the race, and then in the race, very difficult to overtake. But there could, of course, be some racing between Oscar and Lando. Have we ever seen that in Hungary before? Oh, yeah, I think we have. And there was actually a weird moment in FP2 when they were on fuel, actually, when they were on medium tyres. And we just saw Lando all locked up, about to T-bone Oscar, going into turn one. Quite sure what that was all about, but it was kind of role reversal of what we'd seen in the Grand Prix last year, of course, where Oscar, off the line, left his braking really late and nearly ran into Lando and Max Verstappen. It was only because Lando moved and then Max moved that Oscar didn't hit anything. If he had, history would have been completely different, of course. Anyway, that was weird to see that, but I don't know. Maybe that's a portent of what we're going to see on Sunday. So the Hungaroring looking spruce, looking good, modernised. This is the 40th running of the Hungarian Grand Prix as a World Championship event. Of course, we did have Hungarian Grand Prix in the 30s, and we've had races in Budapest since then in the 1960s. But the first time at the Hungaroring was 1986, when the race was won by Nelson Piquet with a valiant pass around the outside of Ayrton Senna into turn one, the two Brazilians going at it. Anyway, we'll see what happens tomorrow for qualifying going into the Hungarian Grand Prix. Qualifying really important in Hungary, incredibly difficult to overtake. As we keep saying, no driver ever wins from the middle of the grid, do they, in Hungary? Michael Schumacher, Nigel Mansell, can be done, and of course the weather could play a role in addition. Well, as bizarre qualifying sessions go, this was about the best of the lot. Let's begin by having a look at the qualifying results, and you'll see immediately that there is something rather strange. There's a lot of drivers who didn't set their fastest lap in Q3 or even in Q2 for that matter. Let's have a look at the results straight away. Charles Leclerc on the pole for Ferrari, saying "Mamma mia" as he pulled up into the pit lane to the celebration of his team. Charles Leclerc 15.372. Then the two McLaren drivers right behind him. Oscar Piastri will start on the front row. Lando Norris P3. But look at that. Both of them under 1:15 in Q2, but are unable to get anywhere near that in Q3. We'll get onto that in a minute as to why that probably was the case. George Russell will start fourth for Mercedes. Fifth and sixth, beautifully consistent laps throughout qualifying by Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll in the Aston Martins. Seventh, Gabriel Bortoleto in the Jonathan Wheatley run, Sauber Ferrari. Excellent performance from Gabriel Bortoleto, ahead of Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. They did make changes overnight. It wasn't too bad in FP3 this morning, but he said, in nice phrase he used, "I need more compliance at the rear of the car." And when they did that, they took away everything from the front. And he finished FP3 saying the back end is a disaster, it's like driving on ice again. I guess they stiffened up the rear a bit and gave him a bit more front as well on the car. But for Max, it was a question of either having a decent front or a decent rear. He could never get a balance between the two. But he did pick up a little bit of pace towards the end relative to the opposition. Then Liam Lawson and Isaac Hadjar did very well again for Racing Bulls. Oliver Behrman. Lewis Hamilton did not make it out of Q2 in the car, effectively, that Charles Leclerc then put on the pole. As Lewis came into his garage, disgruntled, of course, because he'd been very near Charles. Charles had been 10th as they went into the second part of Q2, and Lewis 11th, 1/10 behind him. But Charles vaulted up to P5, whereas Lewis did not, and he didn't get out of Q2. It was an interesting little cameo because Charles got on the radio before the last phase in Q2 saying, "Look, I don't care about anything else. Get me out of the garage. I want to have as few cars in front of me as possible." There was a bit of rain that had been falling at the beginning of Q2. As it was, the track got very quick at the back end of Q2, and Charles, as I say, did respond to that, and he was something like 5th quickest, whereas Lewis did not. So the big question is why Lewis was saying that and why he was not able to get into Q3. I think there were two main reasons. One, he caught Franco Colapinto. He followed Charles out of the pit lane, got to say, so he was out pretty early as well. But he caught Franco Colapinto going into turn 6-7, which is quite an important part, and he was slightly offline in order to get into 6 relatively cleanly. And as a result, his mid-corner speed in turn 6-7 was something like 5 kilometers slower than Charles on that lap, and slower than he'd been in his first run in Q2. So that was one thing. He did get traffic, and I think maybe that's why he was saying every time, But also have a look at this. This is the top speeds of Charles and Lewis as they began their last runs in Q2. Not at the end of the Q2 run, because obviously they back off, but at the beginning. And this is as they're going down just before the braking area into turn 1. Charles Leclerc 3.22, Lewis Hamilton 3.18. Look, to me, they're running about the same amount of downforce. So maybe that's an engine thing. What is it? This is a bizarre difference. Use that word twice now. Between Lewis and Charles Leclerc in top speed. Top speed not that significant around Hungary, but for one lap when you're trying to get from Q2 to Q3, it's extremely significant. The only thing I'd say is that the dreaded Franco Colapinto that Lewis caught going into turn 6 was going slowly just before that braking area, and Charles was right behind him and might have been able to get a little bit of a tow. I doubt it, because there was a huge speed differential between the two of them. But nonetheless, Charles was able to pass him just before the braking area into 1, and maybe that made the difference. And maybe that was enough for Lewis to say every time. Anyway, Lewis didn't get out of Q2. Charles Leclerc is on the pole. Now, just as a distraction, this is not really relevant to anything at all. I thought, given the number of drivers that did set faster laps other than in Q3, I thought it might be interesting to see if we did a fake grid based on everybody's fastest lap in qualifying. And some drivers were quicker in Q1 than they were in Q2. A lot of drivers were quicker in Q2 than they were in Q3. There are two provisos here, of course. One is that, as ever in qualifying in this system that we have, some drivers, if they just get into Q2, then don't even run in the first run in Q2 to save a set of tyres, and the same if you're going from Q2 to Q3. So they're not representative of completely in terms of what everybody is capable of doing, running new sets, 2 new sets in every section of qualifying. And then beyond that, of course, there were significant weather condition changes between Q1 and Q3. Q1, there was a 9-kilometre easterly wind blowing. Q3, there was an 11-kilometre westerly wind blowing. So big change. And that, as Oscar Piastri said after qualifying, it's a bit pathetic to be talking about wind direction or wind strength even being significant when you're talking about Formula One qualifying. But it is significant, and wind direction, wind strength affects different cars differently, depends on error, depends when you're out, depends on the angle you got the car, the yaw, everything else you got going on. So there were significant changes, on top of which the track temperature was something like 50 at the start of Q1 and then dropped to around 42 in Q3. And I think this helped some teams like Red Bull and Mercedes, who are running their tyres too hot. They were able to get more out of their cars as the track got cooler, whereas McLaren, who run very well in hot weather, actually lost some grip and balance as the conditions and the weather conditions changed. Anyway, taking all of that into account, look at what the grid could be in this fantasy world if we counted the fastest lap recorded by every driver throughout qualifying. Lando Norris would be on the pole, Oscar Piastri would be second, George Russell third, Lance Stroll fourth, Fernando Alonso fifth, and Charles Leclerc would be down in sixth place. Now, that's because he just did that pole thing in this final little cameo of Q3, but it was actually completely unrelated in terms of the patterns to everything that happened in qualifying. It was this weird thing where all this, the wind change, the temperature change, everything else that went on, and something else we'll talk about in a minute as well. Then Isaac Hadjar ahead of Max Verstappen. And look at Lewis Hamilton, 12 on the actual grid, 13th on this one. So yeah, a lot of changes. Carlos Sainz further up, Colapinto further down, and so on. But anyway, as I say, that doesn't mean anything at all, really, because the only thing that matters is what they do in that final run in Q3. So on that basis, let's start to dissect what actually happened on that final run in Q3. Top speeds, first of all. The wind's changed now, and everybody's thinking that the track is slower. And indeed, they're looking at the McLarens, who seem to be going half a second slower than they did in Q2, and that's a sort of barometer for everybody down the pit lane. In terms of top speed on their final quick laps, George Russell 3.17, Charles Leclerc 3.15, Max 3.14, and then the two McLarens really slow 3.11. That means McLaren have got a lot of downforce, a lot of inherent downforce. That means that George and Charles Leclerc taking a lot of top speed advantage into the race, and that might be significant tomorrow with Charles if he can get a really good start, and maybe he can break away from the McLarens from DRS with that top speed. Let's wait and see. That translates into the following sector results on the last run in Q3. Charles Leclerc was actually quickest in sectors 1 and 2. 1, yeah, the top speed had a lot to do with it, but sector 2, unbelievable for him to be quicker than both McLaren drivers, bearing in mind that is just all corners, some medium speed corners, plus some high downforce, change of direction, slowish corners as well. 26.4 and the two McLarens and the 26.5s for that sector. And then sector 3, they're basically all the same, although Lando was quickest in sector 3, just throwing that McLaren around in frustration more than anything else, I think. So let's focus now right down into sector 2 to see what was going on there. And I've chosen turn 6 and turn 6, turn 7, which is a very typical Hungaroring right and then left tight section of road. In Q2, when there was not much wind, Charles Leclerc 113 there. Q3 with now a westerly wind blowing 11 kilometers an hour. Charles Leclerc 116. That looks like what you'd normally do between Q2 and Q3. You go quicker, yet another new set of Pirelli softs, getting more and more used to the feel of the tires, the circuit's rubbering in, you're going out relatively late. That's about what you'd normally see, that progression. But look at the two McLaren drivers, Q2 118 and 116. Q3 into that westerly 106, 112. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I think it looks like Oscar kind of lost it, and he's probably sliding there and taking off quite a lot of speed. But let's take Lando's speed as a good barometer. He's still 4 kilometers an hour quicker in the middle of a slow corner in Sector 2 in Hungary with that westerly wind blowing strongly. Now moving a little bit further around the lap, turn 11. I've only put that in really because just to be self-indulgent really. I love that corner. It's a quick corner. I love quick corners, as we all do, I think, as most of the drivers do. Turn 11 is a downhill quick right-hander leading onto a straight, so it's worth talking about because there is a straight afterwards, and being quick through there, having a quick exit from there, very important. Who was quickest there? As the wind grew stronger, as the temperatures came down, the Red Bull starting to look just like a Red Bull again, particularly on fast corners. Max Verstappen 245, and then you can see Oscar Piastri 244, Lando 241, George Russell 243. Very good job by Mercedes all day to manage all the compromises. Charles Leclerc 242, and then the two Aston Martins. It's quite interesting to see the two Aston Martins. I don't know whether this is a Fernando thing that he's passed on to Lance or what, but in the approach to turn 11, they come out of a quicker series of S's than the 6-7 section. It's quite a fast exit from there, and they're approaching 11 in 6th gear, and guys like Max, Piastri and Norris go into 11 without braking at all. They just lift. In the case of Oscar, he's lifting less than Lando. Lando lifts more for longer but has the car more settled, so he's not losing that much time. Max is just like that, incredible, no braking. The only three drivers, like as yesterday, who aren't braking going into 11. Charles Leclerc is braking, but he's kind of left foot braking. He's taking throttle out of it, but there's not a moment when he just has brakes. He's braking against throttle. But the two Aston Martins both brake, but they actually select 7th gear before turn 11. Everybody else stays in 6th. And it's not that they've got different ratios. It's not as if they're on the limiter. They're actually changing into 7th at relatively low revs. And I can only think this is a Fernando thing of just letting the car settle. It's a sort of Jackie Stewart thing. Always be in a longer gear if you can. The car is going to be calmer. And it's I would say it is classic Fernando, and he's passed it on to Lance, and Lance is doing exactly the same thing. Very impressive to see that. You'd say, well, they're not that quick, but it's not because they're taking 7th and then going down to 6th. It's just that the Aston Martin still, on very quick corners like that, probably is still not a match even for a Red Bull in terms of downforce. But interesting difference in gear changing there, I thought. So now as to why Charles was able to do what he did at the end there. Well, some of you know what I'm going to say, because I've always said Max and Charles, and to some extent Lewis, certainly Lewis pre-21, and a little bit today. He was still driving very well, I thought. But certainly, let's say Max and Charles now are the two leading proponents of short corner driving in Formula One. It isn't to say they use a different line, because if it was as simple as that, everyone would take a shorter line. You just take a shorter line to have a shorter lap. No, it's not that. It's the subtlety and the suppleness of movement and the economy of movement and the rate of reaction to everything that's going on around dynamically in the car that enable Max and Charles to be able to get the front end to work when they're going into the corner quite early. And it's all to do with it's a balancing act, and they're doing it beautifully with footwork mainly, but also handwork. And I've often said that when you have a talent like that, it gives you a much broader brush of operation and to be able to react to all the variables that come into play. And I often list them. It could be the wind, it could be oil, it could be tyres going off, it could be a number of things like that. And I think that's what we saw today. For Charles, it was, well, this is Q3. This is the last run in Q3. I always go quicker on the last run in Q3. I'm going to do one of my laps. Oh, the wind's different. Oh, the car feels different. And he's just manipulating the car. He's not, that's all he's thinking. And then he's just naturally manipulating it. And I think at McLaren, where the drivers, when they're in the car, operating the car, have far fewer tools because they're on a much finer ribbon of operation. Because they're going in wider, they're more dependent on braking later, getting the power on sooner, all the edgy things that have very little margin for error. Because of all that, when the variables change in a big way, as they did between Q2 and Q3, I think McLaren were a bit shocked. They didn't really know how to react. I know that the engineers, of course, couldn't do anything anyway. But I think the two drivers were thinking, wow, the car feels different, or the back end's gone, it's suddenly an unstable rear, which I didn't have before, and they're driving around that. Whereas Charles thinking, oh yeah, unstable rear, yes, balance it like this, no problem. And it's just normal bread and butter for him. And I think that's what we saw today, the difference between a great short corner driver and the two McLaren drivers, who are sort of classic drivers in their own way. Oscar has advantages over Lando, Lando has advantages over Oscar. Put them together and they're a great composite, classic Grand Prix driver. But there were no match for a driver of Charles' quality right at the end of qualifying there. And on top of that, Charles was able still to have that top speed advantage, but it wasn't as great in Q3 as it was in Q2. His top speed came down as well. But it was just there. He certainly wasn't losing any ground to the opposition in terms of top speed. And he just did it beautifully. And I think George Russell and Mercedes did a very good job as well. George particularly, he doesn't have quite the breadth of Charles Leclerc when it comes to all the different things he can do with the throttle, the steering and the brakes. He doesn't have quite the same breadth of operation as Charles because he doesn't go into the corners earlier. He's not as polished in that area, but he's very, very good at what he does. And as I said in a video we got out at the moment, one of George's great qualities is his ability to have the car sitting squarely on the road. And that's a great time management thing as well. And it's a good thing when the variables do change and you can react to it because you're always looking for the car to be stable and to be flat to the road. Fernando Alonso, same thing in the Aston Martin. Another reason why he went well today, even when these variables came into play. And to reiterate that point about Charles, I think that was also why he did so well at the end of Q2 when he was P10. He was right on the bubble. He was 10th. Lewis was 11th. Under pressure, he went out and did the time. Again, that is a driver on the top of his game, and not only a driver, but a great short corner driver with all that repertoire that he has. And that's why I think he was again able to get up to P5. I'm not saying Lewis doesn't have that, and I'm not sitting here defending Lewis Hamilton all the time, but I am curious as to why his top speed was so down on Charles, and there's no doubt that he had to go offline to avoid Colapinto going into turn 6 as well. Red Bull, a scrappy day, but it kind of started to gather momentum as these conditions changed and Max was able to do more as a driver, as distinct from just living with everything that was going on with the car, the tyres overheating, no grip at the front, no grip at the rear, driving on ice, all the stuff he's been talking about. But as qualifying went into the last moments of Q3, he did get a bit more grip, I think, when the temperature went down. And with the crosswinds, and there would have been crosswinds at certain moments, and certainly with the westerly, he had a different car, and he could be Max Verstappen a little bit, just showing what he can do with all those tools that he has at his fingertips. Yuki Tsunoda, by contrast, an outburst in FP3 this morning, which I was absolutely shocked by. I mean, if there's anything going to give Isaac Hadjar that drive pretty soon, it was this. I mean, there's Yuki. Quite obviously, Red Bull, the engineering team behind Yuki, had forgotten or made some sort of error to do with brake bias adjustment when the settings on the car were changed or they put more fuel in the car, whatever it was. And Yuki just exploded on the radio and finished by saying, "Wake up, guys!" Now, for a guy who's just been given a massive promotion to go to the Red Bull A team, I think that was completely uncalled for. And I was shocked to hear that, to be honest. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Isaac Hadjar, again, looking very good, although on this occasion, just slower than Liam Lawson, who was, the first time I ever really noticed Liam Lawson, oddly, was in Hungary. Oddly, on the last corner, actually, where he had a massive lose in FP3 today, coming into the last corner. Typical Liam, asking so much of the car coming out of the second last corner on the right rear, and then asking so much on the left. He just lost the lot. But he calmed down for qualifying, and because he's quite a car control-y drive with a rear type driver, he was able to sort of fight with all these variables that came into play pretty well and found a sweet spot and did a very good job. So Racing Bulls, again, excellent performance. Now in the hands of Alan Permain, very, very good guy from going back to the early Benetton days. But meanwhile, you've got to be wondering what Laurent Mekies is thinking. He goes to Red Bull and they have just about the worst qualifying session they've had for, I don't know. Well, in some ways, the worst qualifying session they've ever had in terms of the car not working. They've had terrible qualifying sessions before, but it's usually been in the Renault days and when something wasn't working on the engine side. But for this car to be that bad around Hungary was just deplorable, really. So as soon as Laurent arrives, completely destroyed. Yeah, I'm only joking. Of course, there's no way in the world he's been there long enough to have had any effect at all. We'll see how it goes tomorrow. From Max's point of view, I'm sure we'll be hoping for rain, for colder temperatures, lots of wind. McLaren will be wanting it to be hot with no wind, lots of sunshine. Charles Leclerc will be going down the Max path, I would think, in terms of what he'd like the weather to be. And George Russell, racer that he is probably thinking, well, I'll take it either way. He probably wants it a bit cooler as well, I would imagine. So yeah, interesting day, fascinating day. But we shouldn't end, of course, without reflecting on this being the 40th anniversary of the Hungarian Grand Prix, which began. First race was held in 1986, as I mentioned in the vid yesterday. But of course, motor racing in Hungary was nothing new. 1936, the Grand Prix was held in the park, in the middle of the city, won by Tazio Nuvolari. This picture shows Rudolf Caracciola leading Achille Vazzi in the Mercedes and Auto Union, respectively. Massive crowd turned out for that. Even bigger crowds turned out in the mid-60s to watch Sir John Whitmore win a round of the European Touring Car Championship in his Allen Mann Lotus Cortina, on the cobblestones in the middle of the city of Budapest. Crowds loved that as well. And then, of course, came the Hungaroring, the building of the Hungaroring, the opening of the circuit, and the first race held in 1986. And the reason I mention all of that, really, is because if you look at the description below this video, you can pre-order an REC Lotus 98T Turbo Chassis 04 watch that contains part of the DNA, part of the actual aluminium that was in that car that Ayrton Senna drove in the 1986 Hungarian Grand Prix, with which he took pole position and with which he finished second to Nelson Piquet and led more than half the race. The plenum tubes at the top of the engine were made by Team Lotus. They were the same at every race, the second half of the year. And it's the alley from those plenum tubes that forms the tachymeter of this watch. So it's particularly poignant, I think, going into this 40th anniversary of the Hungarian Grand Prix. The car that Ayrton drove in that race, you can have a part of it on your watch. We'll talk about how he went in the race and what actually happened in that 86 Hungarian Grand Prix in the race video tomorrow. What is it about Hungary? Always brilliant races, well, usually always brilliant races around this circuit near Budapest, celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. And what a race it was for that occasion. Charles Leclerc on the pole. You could argue maybe qualified out of position. We'll get onto that in a second. Two McLarens banked up behind him. Charles made a perfect start. Brilliant start. Didn't have to do any defence at all. Got onto the racing line relatively quickly. And Bob's your uncle. He was off into the, I was going to say into the distance. It looked for the first phase of the race that it was going to be a Charles Leclerc Ferrari race. Win at the slowest possible speed. Come in at the correct moments for the two-stop strategy. McLarens would have to do the same. And he would win. Yeah, well, that didn't happen, did it? It was a complicated race in that there was so much going on, different strategies, Lando against Oscar, and of course Charles against the two of them. So what I'm going to do is just pick some highlights, and I think they will hopefully tell the story of how this race was won and indeed lost. So let's start initially from Lando Norris's perspective, because he did win the Hungarian Grand Prix. Making up, you could say more than making up, well, certainly making up for what happened last year when, of course, he had to give the win, obliged to give the win from team orders to Oscar Piastri. And indeed, on the first corner, had to turn the steering wheel to the left in the middle of a right-hander to avoid Oscar, who came down the inside and nearly T-boned him. Had a bit of a cameo of that later in this Grand Prix as well. But Lando made a pretty good start. He was quick off the line, on the grippy side of the grid. He was P3, of course. But he got boxed in down the inside, and as a result, George Russell got past him. So he was kind of in the traffic and a little bit lost in the early laps of the race. He had the pace over George, but he did a very good job there, I think, initially of looking after his tyres and generally thinking about the race end, thinking about the end of the race in those first 10 laps of the race. And I think there was a telling moment when Lando's race engineer got onto the radio when he was battling with George and said, Lando, the wide line through turn 2 is probably better than what you did just then. Actually, what he did the previous lap, I thought looked really good. Early corner, really impressive. But anyway, they said the wide line is quicker, and I think it is quicker around turn 2. There's a lot more grip in the middle of the road there. And Lando, instead of doing a Charles Leclerc or perhaps even a George Russell and saying, let me drive the car, don't tell me how to drive, sort of thing, said in his own laconic way, well, yeah, but I'm not really worried about turn 2. It's the last 3 corners I'm worried about. And I thought that moment encapsulated the way Lando Norris drove this Hungarian Grand Prix and how good he was. There was never a moment when he was frenetic. There were moments when he was ragged, when he was putting a wheel on the dirt and getting gravel, spraying up gravel, whoever was behind. There were other moments of Lando locking up. But in general, everything was very relaxed and very calm. And you don't often see Lando in any other mode than that. And you don't often see Lando you never see Lando doing desperate things, trying to overtake people either. Everything is a clean pass, and he's really rhythmic when he's got a free track in front of him. And so it was that because he was kind of delayed in the early phase of the race, and because the race appeared to be between Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri, and they were racing off one another, chiming off one another, and we'll get onto that in a minute in terms of their strategy, Lando, when his race engineer got on the radio and said to him, we're thinking about a one-stop strategy, Lando, what do you think? I love the way he just said, yeah, give it a go, give it a go. That was also what won in the Hungarian Grand Prix, in my opinion, because very, very calm. Very, very, yeah, let's see what happens. Okay, I'll drive the race, we'll see what happens. Very good time management when he needed to do it. Concerned about traffic, because it's very easy to think about being blocked or being held up by somebody for too long. That shouldn't happen today with the GPS they have and all the radio transmissions they have. The problem in Hungary is that if you catch somebody going into, say, turn 6, it's then more or less a given that you're not going to get past. He's not going to be able to let you pass, more to the point, unless he's somebody like Zak Brown, who moves right over, very, very good in traffic when he's getting lapped, by the way, before you have the run down the hill. And that's the problem. That's the problem in Hungary. And Lando did have quite a lot of traffic when he was in the late phase of the race on his one-stop strategy, with Oscar having now made his second stop much quicker on the road. And I think all credit to Lando for not in any way rising to the pressure, for just remaining calm and rhythmic. I use that word to describe Lando a lot, rhythmic, and let Oscar make the mistakes, which he did. We'll get onto that. Well, we'll get onto that now, really, because he did finish second, and it was a McLaren battle. I think this is the first time we've seen, I think it'd be incorrect to say the gloves off, but we've always sort of talked around how having these two guys together is inevitably going to produce fireworks at some point. And even today, you've got to say hats off to Zak Brown for the way he's handled all this. Of course, things would be much more calm and much more stable had they kept Daniel Ricciardo alongside Lando Norris, and they'd still be very successful. They'd still be winning Grand Prix, still be leading the Constructors' Championship, still would have won the Constructors' Championship last year. But anyway, that didn't happen. They've got Oscar Piastri in the car. And until now, it's always been this sort of unspoken thing of, well, you know, we race closely, but we never touch, one car never touches another and all this stuff. And yeah, we all race together as a team. But today, we had the radio question to Oscar. Pretty straightforward. Do you want your strategy to be based on the best possible strategy to beat Charles Leclerc, who at that point was in front of him, or do you want to race Lando? And his response, I don't really care about Charles. I want to race Lando. Wow, that is quite a big thing for a racing driver to say. I don't really care about the win. I think at that point, it's not. I'm putting words in his mouth then, because at that point, I think it was pretty clear that Ferrari are going to be struggling in the back end of the race, and Oscar probably knew that as well. And I think this is potentially, for the fans, a great way to go into the August break, because now we know in the second half of the year what McLaren are all about. Of course Oscar wants to win the World Championship. Of course Lando wants to win the World Championship. They don't really speak about it other than, oh, it's going to be close. And here was that thing coming out in public on the radio. Much, much more importantly than the stuff on the radio, though, was what Oscar was doing on the racetrack. And he was pretty ragged but super quick in catching Lando. And now let's focus on the last 3 laps of the race. I think press pause at this point to remind ourselves that the 2025 Grand Prix car is an unbelievably good car, especially if it's painted orange and called a McLaren. very high levels of grip, very good balance, very good handling all round, very drivable racing car. So the odds of somebody like Lando or Oscar actually making a mistake big enough to let the car behind past, very, very small. And I'm assuming Oscar went into those last 3 or 4 laps thinking that. To me, the mindset would have been, I'm going to have one shot at getting Lando, one shot only. And the way to do that is to look after the tyres for the lap and focus on the last 3 corners and put Lando and get as close as I can on those last 3 corners, particularly as that radio message had come out earlier from Lando saying, forget turn 2, it's the last 3 corners I'm worried about. And of course, the drivers don't hear one another's radio, but of course the engineers do. And I'm betting Tom Stallard would have heard that. So from Oscar's point of view, it should all have been a build-up to doing it all on the last lap of the race, based on a build-up through the last 3 corners of the last 3 or 4 laps. But he was a bit ragged. And 2 laps from the end of the race, he had a big moment coming through the last corner, a big moment, a half moment, lost the back end a bit, had to correct it, and was nowhere near Lando in terms of, even with the help of DRS. So now we're on the penultimate lap, and he's a little bit closer, and he's got the DRS. And as they're coming right down to the end, at terminal velocity, just for the braking area, Lando brakes a little bit earlier. Suddenly, Oscar's got more speed differential and dives down the inside from far too far back, locks the inside front, which gives him a flat spot straight away. And then beyond that, immediately on the radio, as you can imagine, Oscar, remember how we raced one another, 1 lap to go, no chance now of passing Lando Norris. It was the wrong move at the wrong time, and he did it from too far back. And that was a mistake, I think. And that was there's a lot of talk about Oscar being very calm, and we saw that in the first lap pass in the Belgian Grand Prix, for Pete's sake. He is a very calm, very focused racing driver in his own way. But I think here it was a little bit ragged, and he could have done it with Lando. And here's another thing. This is obviously a Peter Windsor thing, because you know what I think about DRS. But if DRS had never been invented and we didn't have DRS on the cars, he would either have got a clean toe from Lando and got him down the inside, because he had a big tyre advantage at that point, or he would have got him somewhere else out on the lap, maybe into turn 2, not a bad place, or on the outside of turn 2, and maybe into turn 6. Turn 6, you say? Yeah, well, there was a guy called Max Verstappen, who I think passed 4 cars today in the Hungarian Grand Prix, and not one of them was in the DRS zone. They're all into turn 6. Wow. And then the tyres went off, got to say. So that's a terrible day for Max. But the first 4 or 5 laps with Max, they went off on about lap 5. I think he lost the front end. But until then, he was boom, 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 passing everyone into turn 6. Oh, and he got Lewis into turn 4, didn't he? That kink, the left-hander, where they just go down to 6th gear, just as they turn in. And I don't think Lewis really expected Max to be down the inside of him and sort of jinked the steering and ran wide, and Max was straight through. So there's another pass he did without DRS. So, yeah, blame DRS a little bit. And I think that's, DRS lures drivers in Oscar's position into going for it at that moment. And that's, that's because of DRS. And he suddenly felt, wow, the speed differential, I can maybe do this. And maybe Lando might lock up and go wide and I can get him. I thought it was quite funny when they're sitting in the green room afterwards. And that's being replayed in front of the 2 McLaren drivers. And Lando's in the middle, Oscar's on his right, and George Russell's on his left. And George says, well, I wish you'd T-boned him, even though Lando's sitting right next to him. Quite a good moment, that one. So, yeah, so Oscar finished second. There's no way he was ever going to be able to put pressure on Lando on that last lap after what he'd just done the previous lap. And as I say, that was the wrong move at the wrong time, I think. And Oscar had gone into that 2-stop strategy, partly because that was the way to win the race. It was the fastest strategy predicted by Pirelli. But it was also dictated by his race with Charles Leclerc. So you could say that if Lando Norris had been P3 out of the first corner and hadn't got boxed in behind George, there's no way he would have won the Hungarian Grand Prix today. Oscar would have won it. But it was because Lando was back that he had there was nothing else to do, really. Well, why don't we try 1-stop, seeing what happens? And of course, it was a good thing, because in Hungary, 1-stop strategy is always a nice thing, because it means that the guy on the 2-stop strategy has got to pass you in order to win. And passing, as we saw, even with DRS, is not easy around Hungary. But Oscar's race is perfectly strategized, I think, because there was a moment around lap 40 when they got on the radio to Oscar and said, come in now to pass Leclerc. In other words, to undercut Charles and get the lead from Charles. and I'm not sure about this because I'm doing this video straight after the race. It's kind of difficult to know for sure, but I think that was a ruse. That was a Sterling Moss type ruse. Get everything out there, pretend we're coming in for a pit stop, and then don't stop. And Ferrari, I think, fell for it and brought Charles in when Charles wasn't really wanting to come in, took some front wing out of the car and sent him out again. And thereafter, he disappeared without trace, basically. And Oscar then stayed out and did the statutory extra 7 or so laps that he should have done, that Charles should have done, in a correct two-stop strategy, which was why it was so close at the end. 2-stop, 1-stop, very, very close. But the 1-stop won it. And that was very, very good stuff by McLaren to do that. Now let's get on to Charles Leclerc, because it's very easy to say, oh, what a disappointment. Started from the pole, leading early on, looking as if he had everything under control, but then he only finished 4th in the end and Charles went ballistic on the radio. The reality is, yes, he qualified out of position. As I mentioned yesterday in Q3, the wind direction changed. And going into turn 6, that section at the top, sector 2 if you like, basically, because of the way their front wing is, because of the way the car is, the whole airflow around the Ferrari, they seem to pick up downforce because of that directional change of the wind, and all the temperatures went down slightly as well, which helped. Well, it meant the Ferrari wasn't in so much trouble with its tyres. And Charles took full advantage of that, as I said yesterday, the way he drives, did a beautiful job, particularly in sector 2, to get the pole. What we needed, of course, were the same conditions for the race, and indeed it was a westerly wind for the race. But there's another factor here, and that is, generally speaking, the Ferrari is quite good on heavy fuel. Qualifying in Hungary to one side. Generally speaking, it's quite good on heavy fuel. And as the fuel gets lighter, they tend to have a problem with traction, particularly on slow circuits like Hungary. And that was what obviously the engineers and everybody could see on Charles' car. Traction was going away. And he was leading at this point. He's leading Oscar Piastri, but Oscar's only 2 seconds behind him. So they brought him in and they put on another set of hard tyres and they took front wing out to try to kill the front so that he could drive with the rear a bit more and look after the rear a bit more. But all it did was just make the car undrivable, because then he had no front end, he lost the front end, he lost the turn-in, and then he was just fighting with no front axle, no rear axle, basically, which is why he said the car is undrivable. And he said on the radio, why don't you let me manage these situations? That is an extension of what I was saying yesterday about Charles' platform. That is what I was saying yesterday about the amount of stuff that Charles has because of the way he drives. He can massage a car, and if he's got a traction problem, yeah, he can try and live with the rear tires. He can play with the way he's rotating the car, and he can play with the throttle application. But what you never ever want to do with a guy like Charles is take away his front end, and that's what they did. And I think that's why he went ballistic. And when Oscar passed him, it was fair enough. You know, Charles just sort of basically moved over. But when he was fighting with George Russell, that was over the top, in my opinion. You know, George didn't need to be saying what he said on the radio. That was classic George to be doing that. But nonetheless, Charles didn't need to be that aggressive either. In the same way, he didn't need to be that aggressive with Max in the Spanish Grand Prix either, on the straight, for Pete's sake. And that is a side of Charles. Everybody asks about Charles Leclerc and how great he is and how well he drives and the pole he got. And they talk about, you know, all this. I talk a lot about the emotional side of Charles, and that is it. You know, he needs to be, in my opinion, he needs to be a bit calmer than that in that situation, because, yeah, it was a terrible second half of the race for Charles and Ferrari. But the bottom line is, against the McLarens, and as it turned out, even against George Russell, he did qualify out of position due to that sort of freak wind thing that was going on in Q3 yesterday. And when it came down to it, on a light fuel load, in the back half of the Hungarian Grand Prix, Ferrari were about where they were going to be. So, and all that opens the door, of course, to how well George Russell drove to be P3 for Mercedes. Absolutely superb. I thought he was the driver of the day, really. If I had to give that nomination to anybody, I would have given it to George, because apart from his squealing on the radio about he's moving under braking and all that stuff, I don't think we need to see or hear all that stuff. But the way he drove, and I've done another video about how he's always got that car looking so square to the road and so flat on the road, and that was a classic example today of that. We saw that in the Hungarian Grand Prix. Absolutely superb drive by George. Very good overtakes, and always there. You know, whether he's on heavy fuel, on the medium, lighter fuel, he was super quick, and he set fastest lap, which actually was quite a significant fastest lap, because it was against other drivers on new sets of hard tyres as well, and he did that. So full marks to George for that position. Charles eventually finished 4th, ahead of Fernando Alonso, who I mentioned in that video, very similar to George in the way he has that Aston Martin looking so square to the road and so flat to the road. Great result for Fernando. Seems a long time ago that he didn't run in FP1 because he had a twinge in his back, but great job by Fernando. No doubt he's looking forward to the August break now after that muscle spasm. Gabriel Bortoleto, excellent drive, just qualified well and then raced where he qualified in effect in the Sauber Ferrari, the Jonathan Wheatley Sauber Ferrari. Brilliant drive by Bortoleto, a Brazilian who's looking incredibly good, isn't he? Lance Stroll in the points, P7 in the other Aston Martin. Max drone round, 2 pit stops, tyres went off far too quickly. The car never really gave him any confidence, but nonetheless, there he was, overtaking people, probably did more overtakes than anybody else in the race. As I say, none of them in DRS, but still only finished 9th. And Kimi Antonelli, Max started the race very, very around Kimi Antonelli and tried different strategies, came in earlier than others and finished around Kimi Antonelli, who was just behind him in the other Merc. Liam Lawson also drove very well, I thought, in the Racing Bull, basically to finish where he qualified to. And Isaac Hadjar, his teammate, 11, hasn't had the greatest of weekends, but again, as I say, I'm very impressed with the way his track craft in general, and the way he drives that car. So very good day again for Racing Bulls. And Lewis Hamilton, only 12th, started on the hard tyre. Why not? You are where you are on the grid. But it didn't really work for him. By the time the track was sort of clear of the medium runners in front of him, he was almost ready to come in for his mediums as well. The pace wasn't great. And on the mediums, he picked up a position or two, but it didn't really help. So not a great weekend at all for Lewis Hamilton. At least in Spa, he had a decent race on the back of that horrendous qualifying session, or on the sprint qualifying and the genuine qualifying. So Lewis will go into the August break, having given an extraordinary interview yesterday in the bullpen when he was asked a logical question of, Lewis, you look pretty good in FP3, then it all went away in qualifying. And it looked like he was almost in tears, saying, I did a terrible job, I'm not doing the job, they should get another driver. It's a quote that's, this for a guy, a 7 times world champion, on the retainer that he's on, to be doing this is, to be saying this, to be feeling like this, even if he was saying it sarcastically and it's got taken out of context, you shouldn't be saying things like that. He should be not answering the question for a start, if that's the answer that he is going to give. And beyond that, he needs to be thinking about why he's not driving as well as he should. And it's all to do, in my opinion, it's all to do with the brand, the money, the whole thing that started at Ferrari of, dressing up in the black kit and the F40. Instead of just being ultra focused on just being a racing driver at Ferrari, trying to strip yourself of all that stuff, just enjoying the privilege of being at Ferrari, enjoying your driving, enjoying your racing, and be nothing but a hyper-focused racing driver with none of that other stuff going on. That's what he needs to do over the August break. He needs to strip all that other stuff away. It's almost as if he needs to become poor again, go back to the Rye House days. Obviously, that will never happen, but it's a very difficult thing to do for Lewis, having achieved what he's achieved and being the person that he is now, the brand that he is, to debrand himself and just become a raw, simple racing driver. That's, in my opinion, what it's going to take for Lewis to be right up there where he should be, and I alongside Charles, and maybe sometimes a little bit ahead of Charles. That's where he should be to justify really being there at Ferrari. If he's going to get anywhere near doing that in the second half, it needs to be something as radical as that for Lewis Hamilton, I think. So conclusions as we go into the August break, I've got to say, hats off to McLaren and the job they've done, not only with the car and the development of the car and keeping the advantage they have. Sometimes it looks a bit odd, as it did yesterday in qualifying, but they still managed to get it together in the race. And you got to say, including Hungary, they've done a brilliant job of managing the two drivers and keeping them apart. Yes, it was a big moment when Oscar Piastri locked up with this thing and almost T-boned Lando, almost. Very, very close. But it didn't. And as a result of that, Oscar then had to back away and the race went to Lando. And Lando, to his credit, that very neutral approach he has to addressing the race and addressing all the stresses that are around him, we saw that really pay off in Hungary beautifully. And that was a win that, it's a great moment to have a win like that with this 3-week break now. But it's also a great thing to take into the second half of the year, because we now know the difference between the two drivers. Oscar's come out of it. Yep, I'm racing Lando. Lando, a bit of an enigma in that area. Yeah, of course it's going to be close. I just want to enjoy every race, and I love driving this racing car. It's a privilege to be driving this racing car. Oh yeah, one-stop strategy. Yeah, let's give it a go. Brilliant, love it. And I think there's another parallel. I'm just going to talk now a little bit about the 86 Hungarian Grand Prix, because that takes us into the Ayrton Senna 98T chassis number 4 REC watch that you can pre-order by following the details below this video. It contains part of the alley from that actual car that Ayrton Senna drove in Hungary in 1986 when he qualified on the pole and finished second. And he was leading the race when Nelson Piquet in the Williams Honda was catching him quite quickly. And going into turn 1, Ayrton was doing a really good job of protecting the inside line by being in the middle of the road and sort of covering all bases. But Nelson, to his credit, went round the outside, opposite lock slide, and took the lead on the outside. And you could say, wow, Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris today. Of course, the difference is that that car in 86, certainly in the case of the Williams, was a sort of 900 to 1,000 horsepower car with not a lot of downforce, massive power, a lot of sliding. Today, the cars are unbelievably quick in terms of grip and downforce and traction and turning and all the things, braking, and it's very, very difficult to do what Nelson did to Ayrton in 1986. So I think we should say, wow, you know, at least it happened, at least we had that era, what a great time that was, what a great pass. And equally, that's why Oscar wasn't able to pass Lando. Nigel Mansell finished third in that 86 Hungarian Grand Prix. And that was a drama in itself, because it really, a bit like Oscar saying, yep, I've got the choice of winning this race, beating Charles Leclerc, or just racing Lando. I want to race Lando. A little bit that pivotal moment also at Williams, because Nelson ran a different Salisbury differential, which Nigel had tried briefly on Friday when the track was very different, and he only did sort of half a session with it. And Nelson then ran it and really liked it, but didn't tell anybody. I think he told Frank Durney, his engineer, and that was about it. And that news never filtered back to the other side of the garage. And that was the first time, therefore, that we had this sort of split between Nigel's side and Nelson's side of the garage. And I'm relating this, of course, to some extent to what, you know, we now know in Oscar's mindset there is. And Nigel had a much more aggressive diff on the car and kept destroying the rear tyres and got lapped by Nelson by the end of the race. Still finished third, but Nelson had this much more progressive diff. They're both Salisbury diffs, but you could adjust them like that before the race, that is. He couldn't do any in-cockpit adjustments as per today. And that, of course, then, that was a very different Piquet Mansell team from there on. This was 86, halfway through their first season together. So yeah, and the other point I think is worth mentioning, apropos the REC watch, black and gold, the last time the black and gold Lotus appeared in Formula 1, 86, is that Johnny Dumfries finished 5th in the other car. The much maligned Johnny Dumfries, because he'd been very good in Formula 3. Ayrton didn't want Derek Warwick in the car, bit too quick, bit too distracting for him. Not too quick, bit too distracting for him to have somebody that professional. And so they hired Johnny Dumfries. Good bloke. Knew Johnny really well. He was a blue blood Scottish aristocrat, but you never knew that about Johnny, and he always wanted to make it as a race driver. And he began life in his school holidays as a snap-on tool salesman. I remember him coming around to Williams saying, oh, I'm the snap-on guy. And we became mates then. And we lived together, lived very near one another in Fulham for quite a long time. Johnny rebuilt his own terraced house just up the road from where I lived. And we had a lot of fun together. Great guy, played on squash as well. But anyway, he got that drive, and it was a little bit like Dave Walker in 72. It was a difficult year, a bit like Michael Andretti when he was alongside Ayrton. But that was a good race for him. P5 in Hungary, Johnny Dumfries, very good. Anyway, there we are. Big thanks to RSC Watches, of course. Don't forget to look in the description below this video for your pre-order. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, of course to you, the viewer, for watching. We'll be doing a lot of live streams during the August break, so watch this space, as they say. Looking forward to that, and see you then. Take care.